Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the pseudonymous writings in our study of New Testament backgrounds. The first question that comes up is what on earth are pseudonymous writings? These are writings in which an author takes the name of another person. Now, that's the opposite of plagiarism. In plagiarism, you put your name on somebody else's work. In pseudonymous writings, you put somebody else's name on your work. And you think, well, why would you do that? Now, that's different than using a pen name. For example, Samuel Clemens took the name of Mark Twain in order to write a number of his books. He wasn't pretending to be really somebody else, he was just using that as sort of his stage name, his pen name. Neither is that the same thing as anonymity. For example, we have certain books of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, where the author is not specifically named. There's nothing wrong with that. The author knew who he was. Maybe even his readers knew who he was. For example, in the Epistle to the Hebrews, we don't know for certain who wrote that epistle, but the readers did know because he says at the end of the epistle, he says, I'm going to come visit you. Timothy's about to get he's about to be released, and everybody here in Italy says, hi, and we're going to come see you. They wouldn't know who was coming if they didn't know the author, but we don't know who it is. And yet other things are written where it's not entirely clear if even the recipients were fully aware of who that was. Neither is this the same thing as an incorrect attribution. For example, there have been times when we have assumed that a certain person wrote a certain book or epistle, and we're not entirely sure if that's the case. I think of the example of First and Second Samuel. That's what we call it. Well, Samuel died halfway through First Samuel, so evidently he didn't write the books that are named after him. We don't know who wrote them. You could take your best guess, and you might be right, and you might be wrong. Likewise, when we come to the New Testament, some people have asked who wrote the book of Revelation. Well, in the beginning, he says that his name, the author's name, is John. He does not identify him as John the Apostle. I personally think that's likely who it was, but I can't say for sure. And so scholars have rightly said, well, is that John the Apostle? Is that John by some, because it was a very common name, is that some other John? We simply don't know. But we might assume it was one when really it was another. The same thing with James. That was another very common name. And so we have an epistle of James. Which James is it? Again, we can't say for sure. He doesn't say so. He doesn't say, I'm this James, I'm James the Apostle, I'm James the half brother of Jesus. We simply do not know for sure. So why would somebody engage in this sort of pseudonymity? And there have been several proposed motivations. First of all, to honor a historic individual. We already used the example of First and Second Samuel, not written because that's the author, but perhaps given that title to honor him because the book starts off with his name, and he's at least in the first part of the first book. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to sit in a seminar, a sermon that was being preached by Dr. D. James Kennedy. He eventually went on to be the founder of Knox Theological Seminary. He hadn't founded it at that time yet. It was where I received my Master of Divinity. And he got up and he said, before I start my sermon, I want to tell you about a rumor that's been going around that says that I denied the resurrection. And I have to put an end to this rumor. First, I have to tell you that it is true. And I remember some little old ladies were sitting behind me in the church, and they said, "Oh my goodness!" And then he said, "But let me introduce myself. My name is Thomas." And he went on to preach the rest of the sermon, having taken on the persona of the Apostle Thomas, and about how Thomas denied the resurrection of Jesus, but then he saw Jesus, and now he has become, instead of doubting Thomas, believing Thomas. It was a very effective sermon. And everybody knew that Dr. D. James Kennedy was not really saying he was Thomas. He was only using that as a literary technique. For example, someone might take in a set of fictional literature and use that as a vehicle to propose various teachings. And so it's been suggested, was this done back in ancient times, maybe to protect the identity of the real author? Remember that in the New Testament era and in the centuries following, Christians were being persecuted for their faith. Is it reasonable to assume that maybe someone might write under someone else's name, especially somebody that had already died, so that the real author would be protected? Now, those are all interesting hypotheses. I do not think they generally apply to the pseudonymous uh, writings that we have in the New Testament era, specifically the Christian, supposedly Christian writings of that nature. I think the real reason, for the most part, is intended deception. Now, I say that because pseudonymity was an issue in antiquity going back all the way to the days of the early Greeks in the 4th century BC Athens. You have playwrights that had come on the scene using the names of Aeschylus and Sophocles because they could maybe get more people to come to their plays if they had those labels than their own name. And of course, their own plays were vastly inferior in quality. Likewise, at a later time, you had people pretending to come out with other teachings, other writings, other books of Plato and Aristotle. And people came out with other writings after the fact, pretending to be those famous and infamous philosophers um, in order to get somebody to listen to their ideas. You have the Penekes by Callimachus. He was a part of the Library of Alexandria. He actually, and the Penekes is a catalog, a listing. The word means table or list or catalog. Um, this was a catalog of all the books that were contained in the Library of Alexandria. It listed all of the major works. And remember, the intent at that time was to hold every book in the world. And yet it noted the pseudonymous works, the works that were not, in other words, here are the original works, here are the real works, and here are the works that are not real, that are forgeries and fakes. And it listed, made note of some of those as well. And it did not do that in a kind way. It wasn't saying that's a good thing. It was just saying that's a thing, and so buyer beware. It was that sort of approach that was taken. Now, when we come to the Old Testament, there is an Old Testament pseudepigrapha as well. Most of these were written before Christ, although they continued to be written into the New Testament age and thereafter. More than 65 documents have been counted in this. Some are legends and stories of Old Testament characters. There are teachings or poetry placed into the voice of various Old Testament authors, especially David, if it comes to poetry. Apocalyptic works, and there are quite a number of those, again, assigned to this author or that author. Um, you have, for example, and I'm just going to give you a very partial list. This is a representative sampling. There's a number of books by the name of Enoch. There's one that has been accepted by the Church of Ethiopia. They accept it as part of their canon. I don't think it belongs there. That's my own personal opinion. But there are quite a few other books. The Treatise of Shem. Shem, remember, was one of the sons of Noah. The Apocalypse of Ezra, and I could probably add Apocalypse of um, Zephaniah and quite a few others too. Testament of Adam, of Job, of Levi, of Moses, of Solomon. There is the Moses Apocryphon, the Pseudo-Phoclatus, the Pseudo-Ezekiel, and prayers. These are usually sort of like psalms or songs or prayers of Enoch, of Jacob, Joseph, Manasseh, and even Solomon. And like I said, that's just a small sampling that would be a much larger list. Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, 1947, and it was 1948 before they really came to light and got into the hands of scholars, there were in those finds, not in the original 7 books, but in the other scrolls that were found, because they went back to not just that cave, but they searched caves all up and down the area around Qumran. They found Bible, but they also found works that were peculiar to the Qumran community, and they also found parts of the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha in these scrolls. There were 10 copies, for example, of the Book of Enoch, in that first Book of Enoch, the same one that is in Ethiopic in Ethiopia, but this was in Aramaic. And in fact, up to this point, nobody had ever seen a copy of Enoch in anything resembling Hebrew. But Aramaic is it's a language very close to Hebrew, and so 10 copies of Enoch were found there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, when we come to the question of the New Testament and pseudepigrapha, that's a very pressing issue because there are those who have taken certain New Testament books and have insisted those books weren't really written by the Apostle Paul or this person or that person, but rather they were only pretending to be. Now, I'm not talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually don't have their names attached. There are titles there, but they were probably, I think, those titles were probably added after the fact. So you don't have Matthew pretending to be Matthew. Personally, I think, there's a very early tradition in the church, at least by the 2nd century, they were writing about it that Matthew wrote Matthew and Mark wrote Mark and so on. So I have no reason to doubt that, and nobody in the early church ever doubted it either. But there were some books that were questioned. For example, Second Peter. People wondered about that because it seems to have taken some time before it actually got around. And even today, you can find people scholars that will question Second Peter. Did he really write that? Because the Greek seems so refined, and you say, well, he probably didn't physically write it because it was the custom of people to use a scribe, an amanuensis, somebody who would write what you were saying. And it could be that somebody even cleaned up his language a bit, again guided by the Holy Spirit. But I'm not talking about books like that. Even some of Paul's epistles have been questioned by some of modern scholarship. And invariably, I'll find that when somebody doesn't want to believe something that's in one of Paul's epistles, they'll say, well, he must not have written that. It must have been written by somebody else. And so quite a number of his epistles have come under question. And I have to point out that for somebody to attach their name would have been considered not just a literary device, but that would have been considered blatantly dishonest. Paul himself speaks of this issue, and he speaks of the possibility. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he says that you not be quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is coming. He goes on, and notice he says, look, if somebody's writing a letter pretending to be us, it's not, don't listen to them. That's a bad thing. He's not saying it's okay if somebody attaches my name. Indeed, he says later on in the same epistle, he says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand, and this is a distinguishing mark in every letter. This is the way I write. So did he apparently wrote this actual maybe this greeting? Somebody else, I'm sure, was involved in writing the rest, but he comes to the greeting and he takes the pen in his hand. And what kind of mark was it? I don't know. I haven't seen the original text, and neither have you. But apparently he thought it significant enough that no one should be able to write something and put his name on it really coming from someone else. So the New Testament itself takes a very dim view of such an action, which makes it highly unlikely that anybody would approve of a book being written with that pretense of pretending to be by a different author. Now I want to switch gears and move to what are called the Nag Hammadi finds. These are codexes. A farmer by the name of Muhammad Ali, he's not the same one who was the boxer, but he was digging for fertilizer, at least this is the story he tells, in 1946. He happened upon a grave. I don't know if he was looking for graves. They had tomb robbers back then, as in ancient Egypt and even in modern Egypt. But he said he was digging for fertilizer, and so we're going to believe his story. And he came across a tomb, and then not a tomb, a casket, and he opened it up, a very ancient casket, very old. And he opened it up, and in addition to the remains of whoever had been there, just the bones by now, there was also a large pot. And he said, "Well, that's unusual." And he decided, "I think I'll take that." And so the sealed jar, the sealed pot, had a big, large seal on the top of it. And he was initially afraid to open it. He was afraid that evil spirits might come out. And one story, the story keeps changing each time he told it. One story has it that when he opened it, he saw these weird things coming out of it. Might have just been pieces of old papyri. Um, but finally, he thought, well, wait a minute, there might be gold in there or some other valuable, so I better open it. And eventually he did. And inside were some codexes. So you have these ancient books. Remember, an ancient book, you call those a codex. And he took them home. He wasn't sure of if they were of any value at all. And indeed, his mother later on that day, or sometime in the following moment of time, she took one and used it as kindling to light the fire for the stove. Um, and so initially he finds 13, and now when we count them, there's sort of 12 and a half. We'll still leave it at 12 or 13. Eventually, they were taken to an antiquities dealer and from there made their way to the Antiquities Museum in Cairo. Wonderful old museum that was there at that time. Now, just recently, it's been replaced. I haven't been to the new one yet. There were 13 codexes, one in a sad state of disrepair, perhaps because of Muhammad's mother. And each one contains a number of books. Some contain as many as 8 different books, in the same way that a copy of the Bible will have 66 books in it. There were a total here of 52 books spread out among these 13 codexes, dated to around the 4th century AD. Now, that means that if they were copied, and these were just copies. And I should mention that they're on papyri and they are written in the Coptic language. Coptic is ancient Egypt. It had now undergone some modifications, but it's still an Egyptian language. Um, and dated to the 4th century AD. When we say that it was dated to that time, that doesn't mean they were originally written. It means that's when these copies were made. Now, for copies to be made, they had to be written sometime earlier. We refer to them as the Nag Hammadi manuscripts or codexes because of the nearby village of Nag Hammadi, of not any real consequence except that it's nearby to where these codexes were discovered. And most of them reflect various Gnostic beliefs, and we're going to talk in a moment about Gnosticism and what that entails. Not tablets, the codexes themselves, you're actually looking at an old picture of the leather covers in which the codexes were bound. These leather covers, to try to protect the inner contents, they had been stiffened with old papyri, letters and different things like that, discarded letters of seemingly not a great deal of consequence, although the stuffing themselves can tell us a bit about perhaps the owners who first penned these. How did they come to be in this casket? Several were addressed to Christian monks, including a Father Pachomius. Now, Pachomius, if you're familiar with Egyptian history, is a significant name in the history of Egyptian monasticism. One of the early monastics, the leader of a monastic movement. He wasn't the first monastic, but the leader of getting people together into a monastery. That was Pachomius. And now, is this the same Pachomius? I can't say for sure that it is. Maybe somebody named after him at a later date. But it's interesting that at least this would suggest that maybe these codexes had something to do with monastics that were in Egypt, Christian monastics. The books themselves, there were books named for Thomas, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, and then a separate book of Thomas. By the way, when we talk about Thomas, Remember that Thomas to the Egyptians was a very important name. In their tradition, Thomas was one of the ones that came down and started the church in Egypt. If you go into a Coptic church in Egypt today, and I've been in Coptic churches, and ask who brought Christianity to Egypt, they will tell you two names, Thomas and Mark, but especially Thomas is very significant to them. Books named for Seth, for various Gnostic texts like Valentinus, and we're going to talk about Valentinus, other Gnostic writings, hermit traditions. Remember this whole idea of monastics having at least been in the stuffing in which these books were wrapped. And so we have the perfect discourse and a prayer of thanksgiving and things like that. That's just, again, a representative sampling. Now, let me talk about Gnosticism since they were represented in this Nag Hammadi manuscript. There's a difference, though. I have to distinguish between Christian Gnosticism versus, and I put that in quotes, versus non Christian Gnosticism. In other words, a Gnosticism that has nothing to do with Christianity. Christian Gnosticism explained Jesus in terms of Gnostic beliefs, whereas the non Christian Gnosticism were those beliefs that had nothing to do with Christianity. It was just a standalone series of philosophical beliefs. What then is Gnosticism? The term itself comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, and it claimed to have some sort of hidden knowledge. It was dualistic in its approach. It said spirit is good and physical is bad. So anything physical, the physical world, your physical body, those things are inherently bad and evil, but the spirit, and God is a spirit, so he's good, and you have a spirit, hopefully. That was a little bit open to question, but God is spirit and therefore good, and therefore unknowable to anyone who is physical. And after all, we are all physical, even though some of us might have a spark of the divine within us. The spiritual God brought forth spiritual beings in an original creation, and this brought forth the existence of what were known as aeons, who emanated from the Father. So you had God, and then Jesus was considered to be one of those emanations, but he was just one of a number of these various things, that spirit beings that came from that emanated. They wouldn't, I'm not sure they would use the term created, but that sprung from God. One of these aeons, then, it was said in Gnosticism gave birth to the deformed demiurge, and this is what they referred to as the God of the Old Testament, the Hebrew God. But he was one who was deformed and not good, so he was inherently evil. He was not good, but he was bad. This demiurge then created this evil material world. Shame on him. And part of the divine spark was imprisoned then in human bodies. It went on to teach that some people have within them a part of the divine, that divine spark, but not everybody necessarily has that. So some people are just all evil, and then some have this little tiny piece that's good, but it is imprisoned and it needs to be set free. This idea is taught that salvation involves the liberation from the human body, and Jesus came to free us from those lower levels of existence. So, if we can have this hidden knowledge and find it within us to follow the example of Jesus, hear the teachings of Jesus as retold by the Gnostics, because they didn't want to depend on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they retold them in their own terms. By the way, sometimes they did like the Gospel of John because they could reinterpret it in their own way. Of course, they didn't like the idea that the Word became flesh. That's a bad thing. But they tried to explain things like that away. And so salvation involving liberation from the human body primarily was done through asceticism. That is, if I can just deny the human body everything, then eventually I can free myself. Now that means that procreation, that having babies is wrong because babies are physical, and I'm just extending the physical nature of creation, and I don't want to do that. So I need to be celibate, and I need to not engage in anything that would bring about babies. If you've ever seen the movie by Russell Crowe, the movie Noah, and this is not a recommendation. If you've ever seen it, you probably said, that was nothing like the biblical story. I mean, there was a flood, there was a fellow named Noah, but so much of the story is so very different. The reason it is different is because the director went out and said, I'm not going to make a movie based on the Bible. I'm going to make a movie based on the Gnostic writings. And in that regard, he was highly successful. Again, this is not an endorsement of the movie. It is just telling you that that movie is an accurate, somewhat accurate representation of Gnostic teachings. And if you've seen the movie, you know that it depicts God as a little bit of the villain. And Noah and these emanations, they are the heroes because they're more in tune with the spirit. As opposed to God, he made this physical world and then had this destroyed in the flood, and it's still messed up even after the flood. Now, a contrast between Christianity versus Gnosticism. First, with regard to salvation, Christianity says trust in Jesus. Gnosticism says attain a secret knowledge. With respect to the cross, Christianity says that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Actually, many of the Gnostics taught that Jesus did not die, that a substitute died in his place, that he only seemed to die, and that so it's denying what happened on the cross. In Christianity, with regard to the Old Testament, we teach that Christ is the promised Messiah, promised from the Old Testament. The Gnostics taught that the Old Testament God is a demon who trapped man in a physical body. He's the villain of the story. Christianity teaches regarding Jesus that he has always been God from eternity past. Gnosticism taught that Jesus emanated into existence from the All Father, and of course, not the Old Testament God. That's different. He didn't come from the Old Testament God. That would be the villain. So Gnosticism, I think, at least a pre-Gnosticism, is addressed by Paul in Colossians chapter 2. Beginning in verse 8, Paul says, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. This philosophy and empty deception, I think, describes, and in other ways too, describes some of the things that would lead to Gnosticism against which Paul speaks. He goes on in verse 18, let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement. Remember, that asceticism was part of the Gnostic mode of operandi. By delighting in self-abasement and the worship of the angels, taking his stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body, being supplied and held together by joints and ligaments, grows with a growth which is from God. Notice, it's a denial of Jesus and what he accomplished on our behalf. Now, some of the Gnostic writings. The first one I want you to talk about is the Gospel of Thomas. Let me just say it has nothing to do with Thomas. It was written long after Thomas was dead and buried. Part of the Nag Hammadi collection found then in 1945-46. It was right around December, supposedly December, January when it was found. So the date is a little bit questionable. It was in 1945-46. The copy dates to 360 A.D., but obviously the original dates 100 years earlier. Because if you have a copy, that means somebody had an original from which it could be copied. It's written in Coptic, like all of the rest of the Nag Hammadi collection. It reflects Gnostic themes and is a collection of supposed sayings of Jesus, some of which are lifted right out of the four Gospels, but some, as we're going to see in a minute, are very, very different. There's no historical narrative. There's no stories that are told. These are just sayings of Jesus. And some of these sayings are mirrored, like I said, in the other four Gospels. others are unique. Um, Here's a section that says, these are the secret sayings, and actually this is how it begins, that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. You say, well, that's a mouthful. And he said, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Jesus said, if your leaders say to you, look, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you and it is outside you. Now, you can see a little bit of plagiarism going on from the Gospel of Luke. The disciples said to Jesus, tell us, how will our end come? Jesus said, have you found the beginning, then, that you are looking for the end? You see, the end will be where the beginning is. Sounds very mysterious, very circular in its reasoning. At one point, Simon Peter said to them, make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life. Jesus said, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. I do not endorse the Gospel of Thomas. I think it was somebody's flight of fancy, let me just say for the record. Now let's speak of Valentinus. As we said, he was a Gnostic trained in Alexandria, then traveled to Rome, reportedly tried to obtain the office of bishop, and claimed to have secret teachings that were passed down from the Apostle Paul. So again, this pseudonymous approach, I've got some secret books, I've got some secret teachings that no one else has. He taught that God originally created 30 aeons. Remember, the whole aeons were created. So this is Gnosticism, and that the last of these aeons was Sophia. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and she fell into darkness and gave birth to an infant named Sakla, who then created the universe. So he's taking Gnosticism and adding a few of his own special details into it. Again, the spirit is good, the flesh is bad, and that's all part of the lower world. And then he taught that Jesus had a supernatural body that did not suffer, did not die on the cross. Remember how Gnostics, and he also added, did not become polluted by defecation. In other words, Jesus did not go to the bathroom because he wasn't really human, and that would sort of be yucky. All right. In closing, let me just point you in the direction of what Paul has to say in his first epistle to Timothy. This is chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. As I urged you upon my departure from Macedonia, remain on at Ephesus so that you may instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines. It was going on in Paul's day. It would go on for hundreds of years later. I think in some ways it still goes on even today, that you may instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines, nor to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies which give rise to mere speculation, rather than furthering the administration of God, which is by faith. Hold on to Jesus, hold on to the Lord, hold on to the gospel, and let these other things go by the wayside.